Welcome everyone. We're delighted to have you here with all of us for the Roadmap Language Initiative, Wisconsin Language Roadmap Initiative, forgive me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm Cliff Conrad. I happen to be the faculty director of WEDC, and we have many programs, and this is going to be a robust, interesting occasion. I would like to briefly introduce our panelists for those of you who do not know them, beginning with Pam on the very end over there, who's the World Language and International Education Consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Turning next to Catherine Stafford, who is the director of the UW-Madison doctoral program in second language acquisition, associate prof at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Katy Sinnott, who is the Vice President for International Business Development at the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. And last and not least, by any means, Dianna Murphy, behind me, who is the director of the UW-Madison Language Initiative, associate director of the Russian Flagship Program, and also executive director of the Korean Flagship Program. Many thanks to Dianna for setting up this program today. I think we're still setting it up as I'm speaking. Please help yourself. I know we have a very special treat today, cookies. I'm sorry we don't have more. We're somewhat frugal with our budget. We do have other events, lots of good events this fall. I'll just mention one. Going to take place in another week or so. I think it's November 8th, a little bit more. A program on how career preparation in the liberal arts and sciences can be infused much more into the undergraduate experience at that rate. So once again, we're delighted to have you all here, and they will be orchestrating the activity today. So it's very good to be with you all.
Great, thank you so much. Hi everyone. I'm Dianna Murphy, director of the Language Institute and co-director of the Wisconsin Language Roadmap Initiative. So we have a brief audience participation portion to begin our program. Optional, so opt out if you don't want to. Stand up if, number one, you completed all or most of your education here in the United States. You know. No shame here. Sit down if you do not speak at least one language other than English. So if you speak, I'm going to put that in the positive.
How well do you have to speak it?
At least one language other than English, stay standing.
Whoa.
If you're comfortable, stay standing. If you're comfortable using that language or those languages in a workplace context, in a professional context, maybe in an academic context. Nice, okay. Stay standing if you develop those language abilities primarily through your schooling in the United States. We have a few people still standing. That's wonderful. Great, okay. There's no prize. They're cookies. Okay. So in the United States, those of you who developed your advanced second language abilities or third language abilities, your abilities in a language other than English, through your schooling in the United States to high levels, you're in the minority in the United States. Compared to Europe, this is a Pew Research Center graph. Europe, as I'm sure you know, is highly multilingual. In the United States, only about 20% of K-12 students are enrolled in world language education courses. At the post-secondary level, the situation has become quite bleak. Frankly, this graph is from the Modern Language Association and shows the proportion of enrollments in languages other than English. it's about 7.5 per 100 enrollments. So that doesn't necessarily mean 7.5% of students, but 7.5% of all enrollments are world language enrollments. And you can see that it's gone down quite considerably from in about 16%, which is still not that high, I think, or 16, forgive me, 0.2, 0.5 per 100. We've seen most recently, so the Modern Language Association every few years does a survey nationally of enrollments in courses in languages other than English. Recently, we've seen enrollments drop pretty precipitously at the post-secondary level. And so overall, in the period between 2013 and 2016, at the bottom there, 9.2% over a 3-year period, enrollments decreased. In some languages, it was quite precipitous. In, let's see, Italian, a 20% decrease nationally in enrollments. In Portuguese, close to 21%. The only language of the top, how many is this? 12-ish, say, that showed an increase nationally, and it's true on our campus as well, is Korean, which is experiencing increased interest among students today. So language education at the post-secondary level we're struggling in some ways in terms of attracting students, keeping students. In Wisconsin, this is data from the American Community Survey. In Wisconsin, looking at languages spoken at home, over 91% of Wisconsinites speak English only at home. So it's close to about 9% of Wisconsinites who speak a language other than English at home. So we think about Wisconsinites developing their second language, third language abilities through their schooling. Not that many are. And then looking at languages spoken at home, we're very much an English dominant state. This is not a surprise, I'm sure, to any of you, although I don't know if you're familiar with these statistics. So nationally, we failed for the most part to produce bilingual students. If this was a goal for us, we failed. The truth is, of course, is that it hasn't been a highly prioritized goal. One of the reasons is that very few of our students start to study a language other than English at an early age. And we do not currently, again, nationwide, not just in Wisconsin, we don't currently have well-established, articulated, sequential programs of instruction designed to help students develop their language abilities to an advanced level. The ecosystem doesn't support the development of highly advanced bilingual students or citizens. So this project, the Wisconsin Language Roadmap Initiative, is supposed to fix everything. Yeah, thank you for that. So this project is federally funded. It comes from the Department of Defense, which might seem like an unusual source of funding for language education. The National Security Education Program, which funds language flagship programs on our campus, which are designed for students to reach a professional level of competence in a language that the Defense Department has designated as critical to U.S. national security. We have language flagship grants for Korean and Russian. The National Security Education Program is providing federal funding to a small number of states to draft a vision for the state and a set of recommendations for how the state can better prepare its students to become bilingual. So the Department of Defense sees monolingualism as a threat to national security and economic competitiveness. In this current funding cycle, Wisconsin is one of 2 states to receive this federal funding, along with Indiana. So we have a small grant to the UW-Madison Language Institute And we're working with our core partners, the Department of Public Instruction and the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation on this project, with many, many others. Our vision for this project was a bit broader in scope, I think it's fair to say, than what the defense funding initially envisioned. For us, our vision is to create new partnerships across different sectors in the state to strengthen world language education for all of our students. We have a focus on equity as well as on quality instruction. We would like to see educational supports put in place and funding put in place to support students to be able to compete in global markets, to be able to engage with diverse local communities here in our state, and to expand their language resources, repertoires, so that they can cultivate professional and personal networks that cross many different kinds of boundaries. Here are our logos. Okay. Move on. So our guiding, as we've engaged in, over the course of this year, many different conversations across different sectors, a number of guiding principles to inform our work have emerged. We didn't set out with this list of guiding principles, but we wanted to share them with you at the start of our conversation today. Well, the first is that all languages are intrinsically valuable. There are some languages that today may be prioritized when it comes to investment because of the belief that an ability in that language will further a student's career, will help the state to succeed in X market, but all languages are valuable. We believe that the design of effective language programs, one of our principles, should take into account the diverse needs, demands of our students, of different stakeholders in the community, so the workforce, our local communities, and so we believe in getting out of our silos, I guess is one of the principles that emerged. We believe that all Wisconsin students deserve access to the benefits of language learning. One of the critiques of language education has been that it is for a very small number of students and that the benefits of bilingualism accrue to a small number of students. We'd like for all of our students to be able to benefit from a broader world view experience. We believe that the language abilities that students bring from home should be further developed in their schooling, and so in this initiative we are focusing primarily on languages other than English to address that 91% of Wisconsin that speaks English only at home, but that 9.2% of Wisconsin students who speak a language other than English at home. Those language abilities need to be further developed. That's a resource that students bring to their schooling that is left often to die when they come to school. And then research shows that effective language and literacy programs begin at an early age. We believe that they need to integrate cultural learning throughout, and that sequential articulated programs are necessary for successful outcomes. Here's our process. I made this in a coffee shop this weekend. Proud of myself. The first step, so we're beginning the second year of this project. We have 2 years of federal funding. The first step, which you can't really read, was last summer 2017, we started this initiative by forming an advisory board. We then, in the fall of 2017, conducted a statewide assessment of what our language and culture needs are in the state from a workforce perspective, from a community perspective. We looked at what the current capacity is in the state for world language education at all levels, K through 16. Then we convened a summit, because that's what you do when you have federal funding. They say, do a summit. So we convened a summit in January where we brought together 75 individuals from different sectors to talk about the issues that we're presenting today. And then in mid-November, following the summit, we formed working groups comprised of representatives from different sectors to draft a series of recommendations for the state, taking into account our current landscape, linguistic landscape, for strengthening world language education. And we're preparing to publish that report called the Wisconsin Language Roadmap Report in mid-November. The orange dot doesn't have a date on it, it's implementation. So following the publication of this report, we're hoping not just to publish a report, but to take action. So the final, and it's just going to go on forever, is implementation of the recommendations from the report at the state, regional, and local level. I'm going to skip these slides now to just share with you some of the diverse voices that we heard as part of our assessment from different perspectives, talking about why language education, why languages are important. The first is from our governor, Scott Walker, who shared this quote with us. As governor, my administration is working to develop a strong workforce that will allow Wisconsin's economy to thrive. Improving proficiency in languages other than English can help Wisconsin businesses to compete in the global marketplace. So an emphasis here on on the workforce, and then also on economic competitiveness. Mark Hogan, Secretary and CEO of WEDC, talks about the importance of language skills and strong cultural competencies for improving business interactions. So somewhat of a similar lens. Coming from a different perspective, languages are important for ensuring that all Wisconsinites have their civil rights, that we're able to provide basic services to all Wisconsinites in languages that they speak. And so Carmel Capati, who directs the state interpreters program with the Supreme Court, here speaks about the importance of high levels of language proficiency for interpreters, and about the importance of providing opportunities for our students to develop those high levels of language abilities so that there's a pipeline of interpreters to serve the courts. One of the most interesting things to me about languages, like language is everywhere. Language is core to what it means to be human. Language is central to our identities as individuals, as members of different communities. We've spoken to many different educators who speak to the importance of language education, in this case, in the context of indigenous communities in our state, as the glue for holding together, for furthering, revitalizing this community, united community. We've heard from parents who tell us that they value language education for their children. Parents want opportunities for their children to develop language abilities in languages other than English. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, language education needs to be prioritized for all students, not just for a small number, not just for college-bound students. I didn't show you all these quotes. I added a couple quotes this morning. This comes from research in the Language Institute here at UW-Madison with some student perspectives. And students, when they talk about their language learning experiences, students generally speak to their desire to develop a high level of conversational fluency. When students think about language learning, that's typically what they are thinking about. Many students, though, also, when they talk about their language learning, talk about, are quite self-aware about how they develop as a person, how language learning and intercultural experiences have opened up their world as a student put in. Some students speak to language education as a way to develop a greater sense of empathy and respect for others in the world, for communities that were, not too many years ago, completely foreign and unfamiliar to me. And then, I'm going to end on a downer. You're welcome. This is coming from one of our undergraduate language majors. I left the language, specific language, you can't see this, I left the specific language out. The quote is, if your goal, this is from an undergraduate language major, if your goal was for the majority of students to become fluent or at least proficient, and I'm not saying this to be flippant or antagonistic, you failed. And so that's the reality of the current structures that we have in place in our educational systems, is that we have not set up our educational programs to ensure that students succeed, frankly, in their language learning. And so that's part of what we're hoping to address.
Can I just ask a quick clarification? Was this was the student referring to other students in the program they were in that they were not learning the language?
The student was referring to, I'm so sorry. This student was referring to the opportunities in the student's program for developing high-level conversational abilities in the language.
Okay.
I won't go into too much detail. This was part of a longer critique of the design of undergraduate language programs that include a fair amount of literary and cultural studies in addition to courses designed to help students improve their functional language abilities. The students wanted more of the functional, less of the culture. Okay, so that's the big picture about the project. I'll now turn the floor over to my colleague Katy Sinnott, who will share her perspective coming from the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation of why languages are important from a business perspective.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here today. I really appreciate your time. This is something I'm incredibly passionate about. I unfortunately did take some high school French, but it was not exactly productive. And I learned all of my language skills for Chinese and French just by working in it and being around those cultures. So this is a real passion topic for me. But it's also important for Wisconsin businesses. My role is to accelerate exports for the state, which is incredibly important to keep our economy diverse and growing. So today, Wisconsin companies export less than 7% of the total state GDP. The U.S. exports are similar. Exports continue to grow in Wisconsin. Just in the January through August, we've seen an uptick of about 2%. So it's growing, but we can do better. And we typically export only to 1 to 3 countries in the world. So it's a real low number of countries. We would like to have our companies exporting to more countries. Our top export destinations are Canada, Mexico, and China. They have been that way for about the last 10 years. If you compare our exports to our sister state of Hessen, which is in Germany, they export 40% of their GDP, which is similar to Germany itself, who exports about 35% of their GDP. And these results can be attributed to many things like the country's size, proximity to other countries. Our country is huge, and theirs is much smaller, and they are close to many different countries. But they also have a workforce that has cultural competencies and language skills. I believe that workforce language skills and cultural competencies is part of Germany's success in exporting. And this is why when I'm working with Wisconsin companies who are on our trade ventures that WEDC does, we often find that German companies are our #1 competitor regardless of the country we're in, because they are so strong in exporting. And when I think about Germany and Wisconsin, I draw lots of similarities because of our German heritage, our manufacturing background, all of that is similar to what Germany is today. So what is the common denominator among Wisconsin companies that are succeeding in exporting? In addition to having an excellent product, which every company needs, if they don't have that, they should go back to the drawing board and start again. We found that the most successful companies, like the German companies, are culturally sensitive to the countries where they're going to export. They figured it out before they get there. In addition, they frequently have team members on their sales team in particular that speak the languages of the countries that they're going to. I have a couple examples. One company that WEDC worked with was selling seats to other countries, and they weren't particularly successful. And then they brought in someone from China, a native Spanish speaker, and someone who is a native Russian speaker. And their sales just took off. The CEO said, I went to Mexico, and they only wanted to speak to the salesperson. Of course, they only wanted to speak to the salesperson, because wouldn't you be more comfortable speaking in your own tongue if you were going to buy some complex machinery that you were going to put into some type of boat or truck or something? It would make you much more comfortable. So guess what? Their sales, of course, went up in those countries that they were targeting. Another example I have is a company that had the potential for a very large contract with a Chinese buyer. The Chinese CEO came specifically to Wisconsin to meet that company. They sat down, they learned about the product, they loved the product, and the CEO said when he left, I will buy your product. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. Everything was slowed down. And the CEO from Wisconsin couldn't understand why the sales had stalled. But remember the story, the CEO from China had come to Wisconsin and had visited the manufacturing floor, had met the employees, had talked about the product. So the Wisconsin CEO, just because he was a go-getter, said, well, I'm getting on a plane and I'm going to China. So he went to China and he figured out through that whole interaction, he went to see the shop floor in China, he met the employees in China, he talked to the CEO in China. He made a sale because he figured out by mistake, I think really, or by his own tenacity, that the relationship building was incredibly important in China. So that was a cultural competency he didn't have in the beginning, but he built it just because he wanted that sale. So don't try that with German companies. They don't like that. They will shut the door on you. So German companies only want to come to you when they want your product, and then they want a lot of information. So what is the takeaway on this? Cultural competencies and language skills made the companies more successful. It's not that our Wisconsin companies who are selling abroad without language skills or deep cultural competencies aren't successful. It's just that those who make an effort tend to sell more easily. Because I have as many stories where companies did not take the steps in language and cultural competencies, and that companies just weren't as successful. Examples, I just mentioned the German company. The CEOs expect you to know your product down to the screw. American CEOs aren't educated like that. We don't expect that we would do that. The Japanese CEO who wanted to have a product from one of our companies, they sent too many screws along with their assembly. The Japanese do not want extra parts. They think you've made a mistake. So the Wisconsin company was thinking, well, I'll throw 3 more screws in, what if they drop one on the floor? Apparently that doesn't happen in Japan. They don't drop things on the floor. And so they had to redo all of their packaging to ensure that they met the needs of that culture, that that culture felt they were being understood. It's incredibly important. So had those companies who didn't actually figure it out, you know, had more cultural competencies and language skills, they likely would be more successful. So one of the problems that we see expressed by our exporters is that when they go out to hire team members with language skills and cultural competency, they're not finding the depth that they need. So if I go back to that seat manufacturer, they hired foreign nationals who were in the United States for whatever reason. So they had to go to someone who was a foreign national to get that language competency. That person had fluency in English and fluency in the language that they were seeking. They were not finding that in our students, in our workforce. So that's a real problem. Because when you look at all those examples, what cultural competency and languages offer is the ability to have a much more nuanced conversation. Have you ever sat through when you have an interpreter? I always use an interpreter in China, always, because it's an advantage if you speak Chinese. Or you will notice that many of the Chinese managers today, because China has come a long way, they speak English fluently, but they too use an interpreter. But if you don't speak that language, you can't use that time and hear what they're saying. So it's a real benefit that you can at least say some basic things, but to also understand what is being said around you. I know a lot of people have gone to China and tried to work and had a hard time, and they said, I didn't get half the conversation because my employee who's fluent started to take over. And some decisions were made before I understood. Or a contract was signed before they worked out all the details. So it's incredibly important that we have these language and cultural competencies. I believe that we need to have more collaboration, which is something that you had mentioned. And I'll wrap up real quickly here so I don't take up too much time. I'd like to see collaboration at all levels. I think it's really important to bring in the government, academia, and the private sector to communicate all the way down to 4K. You know, where's that language? We need to really start at the early stages.
Great. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah.
So next up are my colleagues Cathy Stafford and Pam Delfosse, who are going to share with you our plan to fix it all. Okay. So,
all right. So use the keyboard.
Oh, sorry. You can use this too.
Okay. Those of you who know me know that cognitive aging is starting to take its toll. I get through all my dependent clauses and lose my main clause. So here are my main clauses. So this will just give us a map. You can talk about maps forever with this project, of where we'll be going for the next several minutes. And we'll start with the rationale for investment in language education. And I think that we've heard all kinds of rationales up until this point already. And I think Katy said it best. We can recontextualize her comment, we can do better, right? And we owe it to our students to do better. From the kinds of language, intercultural competency training that are so crucial, all the nuts and bolts, literally down to the screw, that you need to be professionally competent in languages and intercultural awareness and sensitivity. These are professional rationales. Dianna mentioned the guiding principles, where we see the more humanistic rationales. All languages inherently have value. Our students deserve to take the language that they have and run with it from wherever they begin to wherever they want to go. And so I think this whole project is sort of imbued with different kinds of rationales, from the purely instrumental, professional, down to the, or over, don't want to say down, over to the more humanistic rationales for really investing in language education. So the process has gotten us to 3 very high-level goal areas that will take a few minutes to review here. So developing leadership and advocacy for language education. Through our work in this project, we have interacted with many leaders and advocates who are working locally all over Wisconsin. And so bringing them together and supporting collaborations, as Katie mentioned, at the state level can be truly transformative for language education. The kind of energy, the kind of power that's already in place at the local level, we want to bring it together. And so the idea is establishing and maintaining state-level leadership to increase public understanding and support, ideally demand, for language, intercultural, and global learning, and also to support within and cross-sector collaboration in generating and sharing knowledge and resources related to language education. For the second goal, developing continuous and effective language programs for all students. So whether you conceptualize the constellation of learning processes that we're talking about here with language education as second language acquisition, bi or multilingual development, expansion of linguistic repertoires, or diversification of ways of speaking. These processes, I think we all would agree, take learner agency and dedication. They take concerted effort and they take time. And for learners to dedicate such extensive personal investment to the learning project that we're talking about here, they of course need to recognize the relevance and, let's face it, the joy of language learning in order to get on board. And so the modifiers that we're using here, continuous and effective, Dianna has already mentioned, allude to the developing of learning opportunities that begin early and that are thoughtfully and logically articulated from one level to the next, from one institution or learning context to the next, to ensure that there is really optimal learning from the very start of formal schooling to individual students' exit points and indeed beyond into lifelong learning. And for all students that we see at the end of this goal serves to highlight commitment to equity in and access to participation in language, intercultural, and global learning, regardless of background, regardless of zip code. And then finally, the third goal, to develop and sustain language teacher talent. This goal really resonates with me as someone who was once a floundering, discouraged first-year high school Spanish teacher, and who some 25 years on, continues to work at being an educator who innovates and motivates and continues to grow. So this is a goal that's centered not only on supporting the ongoing professional development of language teachers, but also on addressing at the state level the teacher shortages and training challenges that the whole country is working through at this point. And so, we'll have more opportunity to be delving into your thoughts and insights in a moment. But I can say that throughout this work in the initiative, it's been so enriching and interesting to envision and re-envision the work of the roadmap through the lenses of different stakeholders that we've worked with, their experiences and their expertise. And I don't think it's assuming too much to be thinking of you all as stakeholders. So holding up your particular lenses, and perhaps most relevantly for this audience, in post-secondary education, what do you see? What speaks to you? And in what ways do you see the roadmap's goals as relevant to post-secondary teaching and learning environments? Are there any initial thoughts that you want to spew out there before we move on? A little audience participation. Yeah.
I recall a couple of years ago in New York, a prestigious private school decided to drop the language requirement and teach chess instead. The whole point is, if there's no requirement for somebody to learn a language, then you're not going to get any students. And you go to the base, you got all the lofty goals you want. You don't have student interest, you're not going to get the results that you want. So one of the first things you should consider is making language a requirement. And that way you will get at least somebody who succeeded.
And combine that requirement with language programs that inspire and that make students want to move
Yeah,
beyond
exactly. If
the
you can't
requirements.
require something, you don't have the teachers in the program to teach it.
Right, because if the students aren't individually invested, if you batter them with requirements, that's not going to be very productive. But if you can somehow make it, or bring out the intrinsic value and help them to understand, then that could be a pretty magical combination. Yeah.
Can I have something briefly in response?
Please
Just,
do.
to let you know, in Wisconsin currently, according to state statute, schools starting at the middle school level must offer must offer world language courses, starting in 7th grade. But language study is not required. And so one of the saddest things I've seen are world language teachers in my kids' high schools selling their wares on elective nights to students to try to get them to sign up for their classes. I think you really hit it on the head. It needs to be required because that requirement then conveys value that we think this is important.
I think a follow-up to that is, mentioned before about the adults, the parents. When I was a little bit older, maybe like some of the people here, but not everybody, nobody encouraged me and my family to take a foreign language in high school, other than Latin. Well, Latin doesn't translate very well, right? So I shied away from taking anything that would have challenged me in the sense of being conversational with, people to handle it. But again, it was nobody in my adult level, family encouraged it.
Yeah, so part of the leadership and advocacy piece is to work collaboratively to increase these understandings of the inherent value of language education from soup to nuts, from soup to screws. Yeah.
I'm curious about just how, I think these challenges are obviously multifaceted. A lot of them are really deep-rooted in culture. And so if we look at, business sector, for example, I anticipate that the majority of even international businesses that are headquartered in Wisconsin don't actually have training opportunities for their folks that are currently employed to learn languages, right? That might be a value add to the company, nor even focus on, culturally competent and linguistically diverse hires, right? Similarly, I think with, the K-12 education system, increasingly, especially I would say as Madison Metropolitan School District has diversified, as well as a number of other districts across our state, we have a cultural dynamic playing out where language paraprofessionals might be absorbing the work burden because of linguistic and cultural barriers of the actual education for those English language learners, as compared to the teacher having the primary responsibility of education for all, right? And then I think that's also exacerbated by institutions even like our own. Prior to this year, we didn't have any materials for any first-generation folks in any other languages. And the reality is, if and where you intend on going into higher education, you need to plan at a very young point in time. And relative to some of the things mentioned early on, families need to have information in their own language, right? Because it's such a sensitive and complex decision. So I think culture is a huge part of that. And although the accountability or requirement component is critical and I think helps push some of that cultural piece, I do think that some of this is actual empathy first and recognizing the true benefits that are holistic and cultural competency being distinct, of course, from linguistic diversity.
Great. There will be some time for more discussion, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over at this point to Pam Delfosse, but hold that thought.
And does everyone have a copy of the handout? We have extras if you don't have a copy?
Are they just outside?
Yes, I can get them.
Oh, great, thank you. Can you raise your hand if you don't have a copy?
Okay, so we've spent most of the discussion to this point in talking about the here's what, introducing the Wisconsin Language Roadmap Initiative and what it's designed to accomplish, what the vision for the work is. And now we're going to be shifting from what is that shared vision to how can we embrace that vision and make it a shared responsibility. Because year one of work around the roadmap was the design of the recommendations and stakeholder engagement in developing that shared vision. But moving into year 2, we're going to be needing to shift that focus on implementation. And we've identified 3 priority areas for engagement that will have more direct support of the project itself. And then beyond this upcoming year of implementation, the Language Roadmap Initiative lives with us and with everyone else with whom we have this conversation. We need to be shifting our focus now from the development of the recommendations to sustaining not only the vision, but the work itself moving forward at all levels. The 3 priorities that we've identified for this coming year came out of stakeholder engagement and the development of the roadmap recommendations themselves, and areas that bubbled up as potentially having the highest leveraging capacity for sustained language learning outcomes down the road. Those 3 areas are referenced here. First, as Kathy mentioned earlier, we're hoping to develop a cross-sector coalition for leadership and advocacy around this work, so that the work doesn't just live on the University of Wisconsin-Madison Language Institute website and in publications that are being passed around, but that there's a group to really kind of steer the work moving forward and to broaden the outreach and engagement. So we're looking for members from the government, community-based organizations, academia, and the business community to populate that coalition to move this work forward. Secondly, it became very clear through conversations that started through our research project and then into the Language Summit. At the summit, we are fortunate to have Senator Glenn Stevenson, Howard Stevenson, right? Thank you, excuse me, join us from the state of Utah to talk about their statewide dual language education initiative in the state. And there was a high level of interest that emerged from that. Dual language education has been shown through research to be a highly effective and cost-efficient means of realizing high levels of language proficiency, but also intercultural competence. So we're interested in bringing together a team of interested stakeholders to provide leadership and planning for an expansion, hopefully, of dual language initiatives in the state. We have witnessed an increase in dual language immersion programs that are two-way or one-way, primarily designed to serve English learners within Wisconsin. And this would be adding to that area of interest and focus by making sure that we're also considering one-way dual language immersion programs for primarily monolingual English speakers to learn other critical languages, or for those same students to be enrolled in two-way programs. If you have questions about kind of the nuances of those program models, we can talk about that during the discussion period. And then finally, we are engaged at the state level through the Department of Public Instruction in revising our academic standards for world language learning in the state. Our current Wisconsin state standards for language education, world language education, were developed in 1997. So the time is right to be making that revision, and the project is supporting that work. We launched the work a week ago with a team of 35 education leaders for world languages, and we will be completing a draft for public comment by late December. So it's a very tight timeline, but please reach out to me or keep an eye on our DPI website so that you can be a part of that work and providing valuable feedback as a critical friend as we move forward. Standards, we believe, is a really important leverage point for the work of the roadmap as we're talking about wanting to deliver on the promise of advanced language proficiency, intercultural skills, and global competence. We need to be designing the systems and the educators that are going to provide that pathway. We have to deliver on the promise through our program and teacher development. So our standards will include proficiency-based performance benchmarks that hopefully will allow us to engage in improved articulation from elementary through middle, high school, and into post-secondary learning. That's our vision for the standards work. So my job is to invite you now to just reflect for a moment. Everyone in this room came to today's discussion for a reason. You had some interest in language teaching and learning that brought you here today. So I'd like you to think just for a moment about, based on what you've heard so far, what you hope to learn more about, and within your sphere of influence, one thing that you can plan to do to help us move this work forward. So I'll give you just a minute to think about that, and then just turn and talk with someone at your table about, based on what you've heard, something you'd like to learn more about, and something you think is in your power to do. So when I first became engaged in this project through my role at DPI and had a conversation with Dianna, I was very excited about it, and I was telling my 17-year-old son about it in the car on the way home. And he said, well, what will this mean? He said, it sounds like you could actually have a road map but not build any roads. So that's the problem we don't want to have, right? This is our shared vision, but the conversations that you were hopefully having at your table now are what are going to help us all collectively make this vision a reality. We're going to be building these roads together and connecting our roads as we go. So it would benefit us to just have a quick share out, if anyone is willing to share what excited you about the conversations you just had at your table. What were you hearing that you can share with the good of the order? What's some ideas that emerged? There was a lot of talking. Yes, please.
I think that a lot can be done without starting over from scratch. And I think one thing that personally I'm interested in is the connection between K-12 and higher ed. And I know one of my grandsons, for example, had 3 years of French in Middleton High School. And last summer he went to Paris, and he got to practice it. He knew a little, but when he goes to college, it'd be a good idea to finish that off. And because in my own case, I learned a language as a kid, and then I came here to the university. They taught me all about grammar and spelling, and so I could function in that language at a pretty good level after I got finished off here. So inside the university, there are lots of options. Business school, LMS, all kinds of combinations that could maybe be crafted to accelerate it without starting over from the university.
That's a wonderful, wonderful point. We don't want to recreate the wheel. We need to know the opportunities that are out there and make connections across them. And sometimes our greatest sphere of influence is right within our own families, our neighborhoods, our communities, to encourage those young people to continue their language learning and to help them know about those opportunities that are available to them. Fantastic. Others, yes, please.
Yeah, this is a very, very exciting topic, especially I am bilingual, and in 1997 I came to UW-Madison, and when it was time to design that first standard. And I feel like in order to motivate people to learn a second language, the resources need to be allocated, whether it's scholarship or whether it's admission criteria, and whether it's a learning environment and learning community that needs to be created at UW-Madison or even at the state level.
Absolutely. Resource development and significant public and private investment is going to be essential to the work moving forward. Good. One last table comment. Yes, please.
We were talking a little bit about, we want to know more about teacher recruitment, and if you're looking for native speakers of those other languages and how you could do that, and ways to promote not just people who are native English speakers who have learned another language to be teachers, but that the native speakers would be the teachers of those courses.
Absolutely. So, and we have a shortage of teachers nationwide overall, not just language educators, but teachers in general. But within that subgroup of shortage, world language teachers and bilingual educators are a high area of need. And we're not going to have adequate numbers of teachers to meet a program requirement unless we begin to develop that pipeline of language learners and allow them to see themselves as potential future educators of the language. So there are some efforts nationally to recruit and develop teachers and tapping into high school students who are studying languages to help them think about that career path. But we also have some shifts in educator licensing requirements in the state through the Department of Public Instruction that provide alternative pathways to licensure that were not at our disposal previously. So there are more opportunities for native speakers to become licensed as teachers. We just need to make sure that all of our educators are well supported and well prepared going into the classroom, and that continued professional learning is accessible to them as they grow. Yes, please.
Pam, I just wanted to say, as a librarian, I work here at the university, but libraries are places of resources, right? So school libraries, public libraries, academic libraries, you know, hopefully have language material, and then it's available for the users. Of course, here we teach the languages, and high schools they teach languages, and elementary schools, yes, to some extent. But the community libraries too, just public libraries.
Yes. Absolutely important point. And as we're talking about access to authentic resources and texts too, not forgetting availability of those resources in the library and the ability to partner with our libraries for public meetings and seminars. Thank you. Yes, please.
A few of us here are parents of children who attend the Verona Area International School. So our kids are learning Mandarin Chinese as part of the program. So we have this great structure set up K through 5, and then this great structure set up in secondary, post-secondary education. But there's this real gap in that middle school and high school year. So how might we all work together to fill that gap?
And I think one of the greatest challenges, and we talked about culture and public perception and understanding around language learning, is that we need to facilitate public understanding of what it takes to become proficient in a language, that extended sequence of effective instruction that takes 5 to 7 years of concentrated learning and beyond, especially if you're going to be preparing to use the language in a professional context or in the workplace. So that's definitely on the agenda. So speaking of the agenda, we delved right into the high level goal areas, but we haven't really given you an opportunity yet to look at the recommendations. Kathy introduced the 3 big goal areas, and you can see in your handout they're numbered goal 1, 2, and 3, that leadership and advocacy, effective programs for all learners, and teacher development. But we want to give you a minute now to actually look at what follows those goal areas as far as recommendations and action steps. So you can see the scope of the work, and just take a look through it and talk at your tables. What really stands out to you?
And maybe just skim those recommendations in bold. There's a lot.
You don't need to go all the way to, maybe go down into the weeds for one,
Yeah, there you go.
to see how it flows and works, and but then for the rest, just stay at the bold space.
I just wonder.
Yeah, and last year I was working in a school in Madison, and
Yeah, I know, I
But if you look
know.
at the big one, you can see what are talking about. 1.2. Oh, 2.1.
Yeah.
2.1. I know the thing that we tripped over. I want to see where it is, the word equity. Now, equity means different things, but in this case, it means access to programs. You can't have an equitable program that kids can take it and just schedule it. It sounds primitive, but you can't schedule it in a way that you're using zero out. That's not efficient. People don't like it. But it's one of those things where it puts equity in question. If you don't have equity in terms of access, then everything else falls apart. These are all great ideas. So we'll probably need to get to the board on look, this is important. The kids are flexible. And so it's a matter of finding something that works well so that you have a quality program. The kids are not working from because they have to hop on the bus to go to the school. It's probably an exaggeration, but not by much.
Could you imagine what it would be like if we had 2 more steps to
It would. There's only one state that had language as a graduation requirement. This is for high school, and that was Michigan. And I know they've had to walk that back a little bit because of budgetary constraints. That's the only state that I know of that made it part of high school graduation.
But yeah,
It's your 2-year minimum. The more the merrier. Sometimes they think, oh, the college is more important. Well, yes and no. Madison does, but the rest of the campuses, they're perfectly happy with it. People come to them. And Utah is very much into it, and it's the Mormon tradition because they've learned languages because of their missionary. So they have this idea that learning another language is important. And all of their governors, their ones, have learned another language, spent time overseas, so they know that. We don't have that. Interestingly enough, in this state, 100 years ago, the term bilingual education did not refer to Spanish, it meant German language. You know, there was an entire parallel public school system. Are you familiar with the campus in UW-Madison? Not the Curtin building, just one of those other buildings right there. It's one of the older ones. That was where the
Okay, everyone, I hate to break up good conversations, but we wanted to leave a little time at the end for some, for your questions, for discussion in the full group. So to start, was there anything coming from your discussion at tables about specific recommendations that was really exciting to you? Anything that lit your fire? Yes.
I would say under 2.4, 2.4C.
2.4C.
At expanding post-secondary certificates and other degree programs, and kind of expanding on that, just kind of educating the public in general about specific career ideas, opportunities. How can I think about this in the context of how could my child use this in the future, such that it makes sense now, which is something I think our community here is missing.
Right, okay. What would be ideas for getting that message out?
I mean, it starts with the parents, right? You know, as, you know, parents of 4K kids deciding on, you know, how is their young kid gonna, you know, what path are they gonna take in the school system before the child has the opportunity to decide on their own. We've got to put them on that path. Educating the parents, and then educating your middle school kids, your high school kids, so that they can see that and envision that for themselves in their own futures in a concrete way. And I think it's fantastic that people want that just for the higher education, but people need to know there's real career opportunities, career fields.
Right, okay, so coming from the career perspective, thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was just gonna
add that having like a speaker come and speak to the benefits and advantages of knowing like a second or third language in the business sector would be really helpful, especially like in high schools or junior high schools, something like that. I think it would be motivational to students.
Right, great. Great. Yes.
I just want to say, like, I really appreciated that sovereign nations and First Nations appear to play samples, like one's as a stakeholder group and then second in terms of like, language education. So I thought that was really neat. We don't remember that from the symposia. And so I just thought that was really neat to include Indigenous languages in the mix. But my question was kind of dovetailing off of the earlier question, is languages or like kind of world languages one of the pathways for like junior high, high school in the Wisconsin school system?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Elise. No, not yet. I think that's an area that we need to be working on. So maybe Pam, would you like to say a few words about what the pathways are for colleagues who are familiar with that?
Thank you.
Yeah,
There's
thanks, Elise.
a national movement within education to prepare students for career and technical education and professional pathways, starting in middle school and into high school, asking students to kind of reflect and identify their areas of interest and their skills and help them to imagine their future selves, and then to tailor their education program to prepare for that profession or trade. We've been down this road before, several decades ago. However, it's coming with significant federal support now, and it's resulting in some redesign, especially at the high school level, of cohorts of kids who might be interested in health services or hospitality and travel or different areas. So in Wisconsin at this point, language and intercultural skill development has not been a requirement or embedded within those pathways. I'm trying to encourage conversation at the state level within the department around what that might look like moving forward. There are states that have done that. California's pathways all included world language educators from the beginning stages of development. So that's something at your local level or as you're working with education leaders to plant seeds as the pathways development work is happening within local school communities to say, how will kids continue to have access to world language learning, and how can we be developing specialized language skills within those pathways so that you're preparing those students in health services to interact with linguistically diverse members of the community in that disciplinary language. So, great insight.
No, this is exciting. I have to say, with a bit of my own agenda, so it's exciting to
Good.
have
What
this
is it?
ammunition. I come from a very small rural campus in the UW system. So for me, and my conversations with Steve have been wonderful, I think 1.2, kind of increasing understanding and support for language instruction. We have it at the university level, we have it at the middle school and high school level, but we have a very, very strong resistance in our communities, which have seen a 1,200% increase in Spanish-speaking populations, to any kind of cultural competency. Because there's this tension and not wanting to walk in and be combative about it, but wanting to kind of start young. And the Verona Language Institute sounds like an awesome idea. I wish I need one. Yeah, and that was the model that I grew up in California. I came from a bilingual family, but it was supported through my school system. It was supported through my community. It gave me the opportunity to learn more language, have more language acquisition through school. So the idea that I could increase what I was doing at the university level, that would be my end goal. I've got to get people in the conversation at the primary school or the elementary school level,
right.
Because it is fraught with social tension in my community.
Right.
So
I really, I think we all very much appreciate that, and the broader political discourse right now, it's a challenging time, and use language, again, is so core to everything.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Ideas for how to bring this up in the context of early language learning in a small community?
I was just going to say, I think you want to focus, and it's already been referencing the way, target languages. So it goes back to the language thing you showed that Korean was increasing quite a bit. Japanese was also increasing, right? But you want to target the languages that will benefit your needs, right? So if I said Finnish, somebody would say, well, why are we doing Finnish? Well, maybe there's a community thing, but it's not obviously up there with the other ones. Or Spanish is obviously important culturally, and also with Mexico, then obviously economically, and Chinese. But my languages for Southeast Asia, I don't think anybody's going to particularly boost them up at the same level. So, but
Right.
you can't do everything. In other words, you have to focus on the ones that are going to benefit you. Right?
I think back to.
And I do have a big shout out for our local libraries because they have
Thank
been
you.
instrumental in driving a lot of, they've gone out and used resources and purchased materials in the Spanish language, and that's where the community has really come together, and it hasn't been the school system, which we would like to not take that away from our libraries, but partner with our libraries to do that.
One thing we heard from, at our language summit in January, we had a Republican state senator, Howard Stevenson, who has been a national advocate for dual language immersion, spoke about how the establishment of dual language immersion programs in Utah communities have been a focal point for, or a way for the more recent immigrants to the community and the older members of the community to come together in a schooling environment where it's parents, all parents are invested in their children, it's their kids' children, their children are playing with each other, that they're learning each other's languages. He spoke to the benefits of those points of contact for community, I don't recall the exact word that he used, but for strengthening a community that could have easily become very divided. That said, there are issues around DLI that we don't have to go into necessarily here, but concerns about DLI models that some, say, Spanish families feel a bit exploited by the program. So there's a lot to work through.
And the work we did in California in our dual language, one of the things we learned very quickly was that they were very beneficial because quite a few migrant families coming into communities actually benefited from Spanish grammar because they themselves did not have that experience. And so there was kind of a dual benefit, was that community members who don't speak the language could learn it, but families who needed extra help in it could also get it in their languages.
Well, that gets to taking the language abilities that students bring from their home and further developing. Other thoughts?
I don't know if this is thought or not, but beginning I do, the thoughtfulness of your presentation and the quality of the dialogue here has been absolutely exceptional. Is it okay if I ask, and further, this document is written with a great deal of what former Justice of the Supreme Court would call surgeon-like precision. Now,
I thought you were going to say typos.
Well, again, a few minor suggestions, but if I could ask probably a stupid question, what struck me today was not only the language piece, but the cultural piece. And in fact, if one begins to interrogate this document, every once in a while, that piece comes up. For example, under goal 2 on the second page, it talks about support post-secondary student participation in long-term study abroad designed to facilitate language and cultural learning. Now, I don't have the language for this, may not make any sense. But when I hear language here, and I hear the word like proficiency every once in a while, it kind of sounds like it's just about language. What I hear is cross-cultural knowledge and understanding that accompanies language. And I just sometimes wonder if that's the architect and the trying to be an IMT, once a year. And, the architect in me said, is there some way to enrich the definition of language so that it's language and cultural knowledge and understanding or something? Is there some way to frame this that invites people and encourages people to think about it? It's far more than language per se. Just a question.
It's such a good point, and something we really, I would say struggled with, but we've talked about a lot in many different contexts. What we shared with you today are the recommendations from this report. What's missing is the report itself that gets into some of those questions. And so I was remiss in not sharing with you in advance that the report is still being finalized. It'll come out in mid-November. And we do try to, in the report, before presenting these recommendations, discuss how do we understand language? What does it mean? Why does language matter? Why should we care? And what is the relationship? How might we think about language, culture, intercultural competence, global competence? There are a lot of different buzzwords around this without, Pam, I can see you're chomping at the bit to add, please. So thank you, it's a really good point.
And your observation is spot on, and a lot of our conversation today had to do with the need for a culture shift and kind of a mind shift in how we perceive and approach language learning. A couple of things. We did talk a fair amount as a leadership team about the role of culture, and we wanted to maximize the minutes of instruction and the experience of language learning in language learning environments to really focus on language use and language development so that we are helping students to attain meaningful levels of language. We're fortunate in our national standards, and the same is true in our state standards, that language and culture are intrinsically, and because it reflects life and truth, that they're intrinsically intertwined and interdependent. So one of the core standards is cultures and the products, perspectives, and practices of a culture. And our national organization recently released can-do descriptors or student language performance descriptors for intercultural communication that really target that deep cultural learning. So, but you're right to call out, it has a heading around, it's the big picture goal.
That is the heading.
Right.
But we are privileging in this project language, and that's, this is a bit insider baseball, but the reason is that language gets left out of models for intercultural competence. There are models for intercultural competence that say absolutely nothing about language. Language is models of global competence for theorizing, for operationalizing global competence that say nothing about language. Our study abroad programs are more and more focused on developing students' intercultural competence and not their language abilities, and are requiring language study to be admitted, and not requiring language study as part of the program. And so we probably overemphasized language here, but that was in part intentional. We're getting close to 1:30. Is there maybe one more wrap-up comment question? Hi, David.
Professor Murphy, thank you for bringing this all together, and to see how this thing has really matured over the last year and a half is really amazing. And
you helped us at the beginning. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being insightful to pull all of these people together. I just wanted to ask you, as you've now come this far, are there two questions. The first question is, are there any surprises in what you found without maybe kind of preempting where you'll go with your report? And two, what else can we do to help you and Katy and others move this forward over time?
Okay, were there surprises? That's a good question.
You can keep that secret if you need to.
Katy, was there a surprise for you?
I had one surprise. We presented this at our key strategic partners meeting, and typically there was great enthusiasm for it, but there were some private sector folks who said, yeah, it's English, we speak English. Don't spend money on it, and I found that shocking, to be honest, that they weren't enthusiastic about it.
And I think maybe for me personally, that it wasn't a surprise necessarily, but the aspect of this initiative that's been most gratifying has been the support from so many different corners of our state and from individuals and organizations that bring very different perspectives. We really tried to cast a broad, to envision this initiative very broadly, to be inclusive, and I just really appreciated. I've appreciated that we were able to get support from Governor Scott Walker as well as from State Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Evers, who aren't maybe on speaking terms, but could, but we both support an initiative like this, and so that's been really gratifying. The second, what can you do, is the question, and so thank you for asking that. So we do have 3 immediate goals, or immediate steps that we plan to take as a project, if you will. And so if you are interested in contributing to one of these 3 areas of focus, the URL for the project is on the front page of your handout, and our contact information is there, so you can let us know if you're interested in participating in any of these areas, except for the writing of the standards, because that was an invitation-only group that's already gotten started. So if you want to do that,
I can provide feedback.
But I think more than anything, our call to action is really for all of you, for everyone in the state who's interested in these issues, interested in this topic, is to consider within your context, what is something you can do? What is something that makes sense in the context of your community, in your school district, at a state level? We hope to see some movement, public investment in perhaps dual language immersion. But I guess I would turn that question back to you, to what do you see in your context? What would make sense? Okay, it's 1:30, so thank you all so much for coming.